Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first edition of Retro Monologues on Retrovolve.com. I am your host and founder of Retrovolve.com. My name is Andy Ryerson. And how about this? Retrovolve back on the internet, live and better than before. I'm so excited about this. What is this? Probably like the third or fourth relaunch. But this actually feels like kind of the most legit one. Obviously, I sold the domain to the Geek Party team, and I'm really excited about being part of their operation and kind of letting them take over and still being able to kind of contribute when I want to, but not really have to worry about all the other stuff in the back end because those guys are obviously a lot better at it than I am. So I'm really excited. I'm excited to be out here again, be out talking about games, writing about games, and there's going to be a lot more people helping contribute to the site this time around. So it's going to be really awesome. I'm so excited that Retrovolve is back, that it's here and finally the way I envisioned it when I started it almost 2 years ago now. So it's a really exciting time. I can't wait to see what the next few months are going to hold. I think our growth is going to be pretty steady, and just keep checking on the site. We launched our YouTube channel this week. We got a whole bunch of new stuff live on the page right now, but I probably don't even really need to tell you that because if you're listening to this, you're obviously on retrovolve.com or on our YouTube channel. But thanks either way. I'm just going to quick kind of discuss what the aim of Retro Monologues is going to be. I actually did start a short-lived podcast last time I launched the site. Probably about 4 or 5 of you heard these episodes. It was just basically me talking about a different topic in gaming every week, and it's something I did really enjoy doing. I do enjoy podcasting. I don't think doing a podcast by myself really came off as very entertaining, but it's still something I do want to do, and the focus of these is kind of going to be to shorten it into maybe 20 or 30 minute long podcasts about, like I said, a game system, whatever. But what I want reader interaction with this, or listener interaction might be more appropriate in this case. So about maybe a week before I'm going to record one, I'm going to post the topic on Retrovolve. So keep checking there, and you can either leave a comment there right on the page, leave a comment on the prior episode's YouTube page. I will check that, or you can reach me on Twitter at Andy Ryerson. That's Andy, Reierson. But the topic of this week's is going to be the Sega Genesis, and this is actually previously recorded last winter, I think in about December sometime. I put this together. But it's something not very many people heard, and I think there's a lot of good information that a lot of you out there will be interested in hearing. And it starts off with a little bit of a background on the Sega Genesis, why it came to be, just kind of the general story behind the development of the console. Goes into a little bit of the hardware, not too much. I'm not really a great hardware mind per se. And the podcast ends with a countdown of my personal top 10 favorite Sega Genesis games. Not the best Sega Genesis games. I haven't played them all. Some of the ones that I do consider the best might not necessarily be my favorite. This is just a top 10 Andy Ryerson's favorite Sega Genesis games of all time. So here we go on the first episode of Retro Monologues on Retrovolve.com. Now, of course, the Sega Genesis was not the first Sega console released. They did actually have two systems that were released before the Genesis. The first being one that was released in the early 80s, the Sega SG-1000, which I really don't know a lot about. I've never really played it. It didn't do very well, at least here in the States, or anywhere really, I guess. So I'm not really going to talk about that one very much. It just is worth noting that it was there and that it was Sega's first foray into the video game home console business. After that, however, they released a system called the Sega Master System, which was designed to be a competitor to, of course, the Nintendo Entertainment System. And while it wasn't as successful, at least in America, as the NES was, it still did build a solid foundation for Sega to continue on into the 16-bit era with the Sega Genesis. They didn't have the Sonic the Hedgehog on the console. They had really yet to establish a brand identity. Of course, everybody knows during the Master System era, they had a mascot that was designed sort of to be a competitor of Mario, being Alex Kidd was its name, and it really just didn't catch on as much with consumers. I mean, Super Mario was just such a phenomenal, or I'm talking about the first Super Mario Brothers game at least. It was just such a phenomenal game. It was so original in what it did, just the whole concept of the game finally expanding beyond one screen. You know, you look at games like Asteroids or Centipede or Robotron, Pac-Man, any of those old arcade classics, or games like them that were either ported over to earlier systems or were clones of them. I mean, prior to the NES and Super Mario Brothers, games primarily took place on one screen. And when Super Mario Brothers was released, you know, that expanded well beyond one screen into multiple screen levels and these huge worlds with tons of secrets to find. So, of course, I mean, Sega tried to mimic that in a way with their Alex Kidd series. Didn't really succeed, but if you go back, if you are into like those 1980s platformers, they are fun games to kind of check out. But anyways, moving on then to the release of the Sega Genesis. What a lot of people don't remember with the Genesis is that it actually was released 2 years, almost to the date, ahead of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which they tried that with consoles afterwards. Did not work out quite as well for them, but I do think, and I think history shows, that it was the right move at that time. It released in the summer of 1989, and by that point, the NES, I think, had been out about 4 or 5 years here in the States. So it had a pretty long life up until that point, and, you know, obviously had completely revitalized the industry after the, you know, infamous video game crash of 1983. I could do a whole episode on that sometime, and maybe I will, but just to give it a brief explanation, basically, in the early 80s, the video game market had this huge boom period with the Atari 2600, with the Intellivision and the ColecoVision, systems like that. And for the first time, you know, companies were making a lot of money off these video games. And of course, where there is money, there will be businesses trying to make money in that. But the industry became so inundated and just full of because these companies wanted to make money, but they weren't willing to put in the effort to make a quality product that deserved consumers' money. So these games came out just by the dozens every week. I mean, there's you go but look back at like the Atari 2600 library and how much absolute there is. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of really good stuff. But towards the end of the life cycle, there was just so much coming out. So consumers would buy these games. They'd look at the boxes, because you got to remember, back then we didn't have internet or, you know, podcasts talking about which games were good and which ones wasn't. You pretty much had to just go by what looked good on the box. So people would get home, they would take these really nice, colorful, cool-looking games home, and they played them, and they were just utter So people got kind of scared away from the video game industry. They were sick of putting all this money into something and just not getting anything in return. And thus the home console industry at least, really just fell into irrelevance in 1983. And as a result, retailers, well, I'm just going way off the Sega Genesis at this point, but it kind of leads in to where the Sega Genesis kind of comes in and how it, I think at least, really ignites the golden era of home console gaming. So just bear with me for a moment, but Following the crash of 1983, retailers were really wary about letting video game systems in their stores because nobody wanted to touch them. They would mark 2600s and the television down to like below cost levels, and they would still sit on the shelves. Just nobody wanted them. So what Nintendo did that was a really, really smart move is they marketed the NES as a toy. It wasn't a video game console, it was a toy. And that's pretty much the entire reason why that dumb-looking, stupid robot got shipped with the system that I think that had like one game it actually worked with, and even then it didn't really work. But it marketed the system as a toy. It wasn't, a video game system. It was a child's toy. So, retailers, toys will sell forever. So retailers jumped on board, got the NES in the stores. And of course, once everybody started to play the games for the NES, everybody was back on board, and the NES took off and basically revitalized the industry, not only in the States, but in the entire world. So fast forward then, like I said, 4 or 5 years, people have been playing their NES. You got the Mario games, of course, everybody had because it was packed in. Tons and tons of new ideas like, The Legend of Zelda, these huge open world games where you can just go out and explore and see these new worlds, these big, colorful, imaginative places. People are wanting more. They are back into video games, and they are willing to invest more money in these products. So, as technology goes, newer, cheaper, but more technically advanced hardware is available, and companies are wanting to make new consoles. So enter Sega in 1989 with the Sega Genesis, or Sega Mega Drive as it's known in other areas of the world. But for the sake of this podcast, I'm just going to go ahead and call it the Genesis. If there are for some reason any European listeners out there, I think you know what I'm talking about. So the Sega Genesis was released in 1989, and if you don't remember, Sonic had yet to come along yet. We didn't get Sonic the Hedgehog for about 2 years down the road yet. So as a pack-in with the system, it's kind of funny to think about these days, you don't really get pack-in games anymore, which I think is a bummer, because I think that's a really good way to sell a video game system, is to include a really good game with it. I mean, look back, like I said, at the NES. Super Mario Brothers Duck Hunt is just synonymous with gaming forever because of that, and revitalized the industry. But at this time, it still was really important to offer consumers added value with their console. And what Sega did for that, they wanted to market not so much to a different demographic than Nintendo did with the NES, but a wider demographic. And they were smart, and they realized that there were people that played video games 10 years prior, that had, Ataris on their Christmas list when they were 12, 13 years old. And that while these people might not be playing a lot of video games now because, like a lot of people in 1983, 1984 hit, there was so much crap that they just kind of got out of it. But they realized that there are still a lot of people that were interested in video games and that had loved video games that were now maybe a little bit older, maybe in their early 20s at that college age. And they saw a lot of potential in there to make a lot of money with these people. So what they did with the Sega Genesis, first of all, I just want to start kind of with the design of the system and the aesthetic look of it. The NES was very, like I said, toyish looking, which it benefited it greatly, got it into stores, got it to sell. But now that video games were kind of an acceptable medium again, Sega went a total nother route with their system and just painted the whole thing black. And if you look at the first model of the Sega Genesis, it looks amazing. It looks really dark. It looks sleek. It looks like something really, really cool. And my personal preference is that first model, the Sega Genesis. It is a little bigger, but I just like the overall look of it. It was really cool in the fact that it had an actual headphone jack with a variable slider on it, so you can play video games really loud at night, not piss off your parents or your roommate or whoever. I just loved that first model of the Sega Genesis system, and I think the look of it was a big reason that it sold well. It wasn't this kiddie plaything anymore. It was this cool, new electronic device, and with it was bundled a port of the arcade game Altered Beast. And I'm sure a lot of you have played Altered Beast in one form or another. I know talking to a lot of people have played like the arcade game that they saw in like their movie theater growing up. And while the game, to me, it doesn't really hold up extremely well today, I do like it. I'll still go back and play it once in a while. But it was a game for a little older audience. You know, people that, the older people still love the Super Mario games and stuff like that. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. But they just wanted something a little more. And of course, that the game opens up with this classic sound clip.
Rise from your grave.
And when you heard that, you knew you were in for like a really action-packed, really fucking badass experience. And I think that really helped the system kind of communicate to the older gamer, the older consumer out there, that this was going to be a product that was going to feature things that they would enjoy. And it really got the system started out on the right foot. But now let's fast forward a couple years to the aforementioned Sonic the Hedgehog. And of course, Sonic the Hedgehog is such an invaluable, indispensable part of Sega's catalog and their history. It really took Sega to the next level in terms of competing with Nintendo. Because when the Super Nintendo was released in 1991, it of course came bundled with Super Mario World. And Sega wasn't stupid. They knew that was a game that a lot of people were really excited for, that a lot of people were going to buy a Super Nintendo for, and possibly never even buy another game for. I think I still remember a couple of friends I had back then who had Super Nintendos, and the only game they ever owned was Super Mario World. And that's really all you needed. It was such a fantastic, just imaginative game. That's really all you needed, and it justified the price of the console alone just to own that game. But Sega knew they needed something to compete. They needed something a little similar in a way, but also something a little different that was going to make people look at their machine and say, well, Nintendo has Mario, but this has this. And what that, of course, was Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, Sonic, at first glance, is a pretty similar game to Mario. It's platforming, colorful worlds, really upbeat, exciting music. One main protagonist, one main villain, but the gameplay formula was altered enough that it did have a different experience from the Mario games. For one, of course, it was a lot faster. And to me, that's what really made me love the Sonic the Hedgehog series. The first Sonic the Hedgehog, not so much. I think by Sonic 3, they really were, playing up the speed of the game. But that is a conversation for another time. But the point is, Sega finally had a mascot. They had brand identity. And Sonic the Hedgehog was perfect because he wasn't the fat, portly, lovable plumber that Mario was. Sonic was kind of a badass. He had a little bit of an attitude, and I think that really spoke volumes about, Sega's approach to the video game business at the time. They weren't there to just toe the line anymore. They were there to tread new waters and do things differently than other companies were, and I think we saw that reflected in their sales and just sort of the culture of the 90s at the time too. I mean, around the same time you had, of course, the grunge phenomenon with Nirvana coming in and basically changing the whole paradigm of the music industry, how, record executives, how the public viewed music and what they considered good quality music. It wasn't about the overproduction and the over-the-top glamorous rock and roll lifestyle. It became very real, very raw, very much about being, anti-authority and saying fuck you to the world. And in a way, I mean, maybe not too much of a Nirvana extreme. Sonic the Hedgehog never blew his head in with a shotgun, but it was kind of that same approach, kind of that same mindset, which I really think helped Sega separate themselves from Nintendo. And you also saw this kind of appear in their marketing materials. Of course, we all remember those classic Sega advertisements. Sega does what Nintendo don't, that you saw in all the gaming magazines and, on TV, and of course the legendary Sega that was in all their television advertisements. I love those commercials, those ads so much. They really made an effort to tell you this was something new, something a little bit different than what you were used to. And that isn't to take away from what Nintendo was doing with the Super Nintendo. Of course, we all have fantastic memories with that system, and perhaps one day I'm going to go back and take a look at that system as well. But I did want to start this one out with the Sega Genesis, because to me, it was what I mostly played when I was younger. It's what most of my friends had, like my cousins had. I unfortunately, during this period, my parents were very anti-video games, and I didn't get to own one. And even once the Sega Genesis had finally, had kind of gone away, because the newer, the 64-bit, 32-bit era was upon us, I still remember I was 12 years old, and I asked for a Sega Genesis for my birthday, and I think it was like 1997 by that point, 1997, 98, around that. Maybe I wasn't quite 12, maybe 10 or 11, but I asked for a Sega Genesis, and instead my parents got me a Sony PlayStation, which was cool, but I really wanted my Genesis, even though it was old and kind of outdated by then. Of course, I probably had about 4 different Genesis by now. They either break or they just disappear. I don't know what happens, but right now I do have the Model 2 Genesis, which is kind of the simplistic, more of, it doesn't have the kind of the bells and whistles of the original. It doesn't have the headphone jack. I did have a Model 1 at one point, but that one, I think my dog peed on when I was little, which I was a little upset about. But anyways, I just love the Genesis. There isn't really a whole lot more I want to get into it now. I could probably make a 3-hour podcast on the history of this system. Of course, we all know what happened to Sega in the end. Unfortunately, no longer with us as a console manufacturer, which I think is a bummer. But if you remember back, if you were reading Retrovolve at all last year when I was actually doing a lot of writing for it, I posted a few articles comparing Sega versus Nintendo to WCW versus WWF in the Attitude Era, of wrestling. And, in a way, Sega was that WCW. They came into the battle the underdog, but did something a little different, a little edgier, more marketed at older people. And they really stuck it to Nintendo, and for a while overcame Nintendo. And just like WCW was, their head got a little too big. And we saw this with the release of the Sega Saturn, and unfortunately, inevitably ended up completely bankrupting them pretty much in terms of their home console market, which is a bummer, because I think the Saturn while it wasn't the best system of the era, I think both the PlayStation and the N64 did most things better than the Saturn. But when the Dreamcast came along, that system was so far ahead of its time. And unfortunately, it was just a matter of too little too late for Sega. But we can all look back on the early 90s as really Sega's time, as a time, I think the last time we really had a really, really fun console war. People get so heated and so worked up about it these days, but I don't remember, at least back when I was a kid, it being a really heated battle on the playground versus Super Nintendo versus Genesis. It was more fun. You had your side because, you only got one as a kid. You never got both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. But everybody loved both systems. You loved Donkey Kong Country, but you also played the out of Sonic the Hedgehog 3 or Road Rash or something. All that stuff was awesome, and I kind of miss that friendly competition between the two. And I just maybe it's just because I'm older now. I just don't think the current Sony versus Microsoft with Nintendo kind of on the side, it's just not as fun anymore. But I don't know, that's all the further I'm going to kind of go on with this. It is kind of a vague, very very limited description of the history of the Sega Genesis, but a few things I did want to touch on, a few interesting points I wanted to make. So I'm going to take a quick break here. We will be right back. I will be talking about the more technical side of the Sega Genesis, kind of digging deep into the hardware and uncovering a few things that maybe you didn't know about before. So enjoy the music. I'll be right back after the break. So when I look back and I think about what made the Sega Genesis unique and distinct to me, the thing I think of the most is the sound of the system, especially with the music. I mean, think back at some of your favorite games for the Sega Genesis and think about the music. I know, a lot of the ones I think of are like the shoot 'em up games, or to me, probably one of my favorites is the first level theme from Sonic the Hedgehog 3. And you just think back and listen to them a little bit and how they sounded, and they had a really sort of twangy sound to them, really sharp, really it's hard to explain really in words, which is why I kind of wanted to play some throughout the course of the show here to kind of give you an example. And while the Super Nintendo's the sound chip in the Super Nintendo was a little bit more technologically advanced than the one found in the Sega Genesis, I really do think the sound chip, the Yamaha YM2612, maybe not the more superior of the two, but the more memorable to me. It had a more distinct sound. You can hear, chiptune music, and you'll be able to pick ones out. You're like, oh, that one's from the Sega Genesis, because it had such a very distinct sound to it, and it was really enjoyable. It was, like I said, very twangy, very kind of metallic in a way. And that's not to say anything bad about it, but I just really enjoyed the sound of the Sega Genesis sound chip. Of course, like I mentioned, it was manufactured by Yamaha, the YM2612. It was basically a stripped down version of another sound chip they had made, the 2608, which was featured in I think it was one of the NEC computers, the 8801s in the 1980s. Probably the name doesn't ring a bell, but Google it, NEC 8801 PC, and I'm sure pretty much all of you can remember at least using one, or a lot of you your parents probably maybe owned them back then. I don't know. At least I know where, like, when I looked it up online and I saw it, was like, I remember that my dad's work had a bunch of these computers that I had played on as a kid. But yeah, the sound chip in the Sega Genesis it's basically a frequency modulator with a few, 4 different channels, or was it? No, 6 different channels on it. It had, and what this basically did, it was basically just a lot like the frequency modulators you find, in a lot of you probably use things like Ableton Live's, audio workstation software like that. But back then, with synthesis, how it worked back then, you didn't have the presets you could click and automatically have this awesome sounding, whether just a sawtooth synthesis sound or something mimicking a harp or a violin or something. You didn't have that. These sound designers that worked on these systems back in the day had to just basically take sine waves and mold them, use different tricks to create these. And to me, I won't say it was the better way to go about it. It was certainly more difficult, and you really had to be talented to make a good soundtrack on a Sega Genesis game. I mean, given today's process is a lot more efficient. Like I said, you can use things like Ableton, things like Logic, to have really good sounding
instruments in your compositions, which I don't know, you could say is a good thing. I think it probably is a good thing overall, but I still do kind of appreciate what a lot of these guys did on this old hardware, because to me, the soundtrack of a game, whether it be the music or just the sound effects, really help shape the game so much more in retro games than it does now. I mean, I still think sound design is a very overlooked aspect to game creation, but to me, looking back at the hardware that these guys used with the Sega Genesis, with the Super Nintendo, what they had to work with and how they parlayed that into a timeless, memorable product that, you know, I'll often just go back and just listen to some of these Sega Genesis, some of the soundtracks for these games just on their own, just because they're so cool and just like I said, just have such a unique sound to them, and I absolutely love it. But I'm not going to go a whole lot deeper with this. I could go on a whole audio engineering tangent about it, but I won't. I just kind of want to quick touch upon another things before we move on to the next segment. I just want to address a little bit about the video hardware, the kind of the processing hardware contained within the Sega Genesis. And of course, we all remember the term blast processing, which Sega used as a way to kind of convey how much better, how much faster the Sega Genesis could process information than the Super Nintendo, which pretty much was complete bullshit. It was basically a marketing term, but I don't know, you kind of look back on it, and it's kind of funny. But the Sega Genesis hardware was really revolutionary in a lot of ways, especially with its graphical capabilities. I mean, you look back on a lot of early Sega Genesis games, and even ones released up until, I think it stopped having made games for it in like 1997, but they don't look impressive by today's standards. They're still beautiful, but I mean, you look at what we've got now, especially on like the newer consoles, and you know, obviously doesn't compare. But back then, it really was very, very impressive. Especially, I think what stood out to most people was just how colorful and vibrant these worlds were. And the Sega Genesis, it allowed for up to 64 colors at once on the screen, which, like I said, doesn't sound impressive now, but you look back to like the NES, which I think it was maybe half that. I don't remember exactly, but I look back in like the old PC gaming days where there were a lot of systems where you could only have like 4, maybe 8 colors on screen at once, and having just that extra palette to pull from it basically was a way of giving these artists more paintbrushes to work with in a way, which I think is what really sets apart the 16-bit era from those before. Just not so much how much more detailed the worlds were, the character sprites were, and they certainly were, but just how much more colorful they were. And I think that was a big advantage of upgrading from, say, the NES to the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo. At least that's what I remember standing out to me a lot as a younger kid when I first played these consoles. But I think that's all the farther I'm going to go into this. I'm just looking at the time now, and I'm past a half an hour on this podcast. I'm really trying to keep it under an hour to not have these long marathon podcasts like the Adjective Play was. So that's where I'll end it for now. I do want to do some more hardware, some more technical discussions in the future. Maybe I'll save some of those for a different time. Maybe we'll do a whole really techie episode at some point in the future. But I just wanted to touch upon a few of these things, the technical, the hardware things that made the Sega Genesis stick out for me. But for now, let's take another quick break. Afterwards, I'm going to get into what I believe are the top 10 games for the Genesis. Stick around. Like I had mentioned at the top of the show, this top 10 list will not be a definitive top 10 best Sega Genesis games ever list. You can go anywhere on the internet, type in best Sega Genesis games ever, and you'll pretty much get the same fucking list wherever you go. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something a little bit different just for the sake of not regurgitating the same damn list every website's propagated since forever, the beginning of the internet. So my list, like I said, is just going to focus on the games that to me represented the Genesis the best, the games that I played when I was young, the games that I personally enjoy the most, because it's going to be more fun for me to talk about them, and it's going to be more fun for you to listen to me, not just trying to toe the line and pick the same list that everybody else did, but really highlighting the things that I enjoyed the most about the Sega Genesis. So let's not hesitate any longer then. My first pick, my number 10 pick for the Sega Genesis is the original Mortal Kombat, the port of the first arcade game. And I go back and play this game now, and I am absolutely terrible at it. But there probably is no other game I played more when I was a kid than the original Mortal Kombat. I remember my neighbor had it when I was a kid, and I would always go over to his house and we'd just sit and play Mortal Kombat for hours. One, because it was super fun. It was just incredibly exciting, very challenging, and we just stay up for hours trying to, beat the various enemies in the game because it was really hard. And like I said, I play it now and I can't even get past the first person in the tournament. It's terrible. And for two is just, it was so violent and your parents hated it and they did not want you to play it. So therefore, as a rebellious young kid, that made you want to play Mortal Kombat even more. And what made the Sega Genesis version so great is that it had blood, and the Super Nintendo, the family-friendly kiddie console, they didn't have the blood that the Genesis version did. So if you wanted to play this game on your home console, didn't want to have to plunk a million damn quarters at the arcade to try to beat this thing, you got it for the Sega Genesis. And yeah, I remember playing the hell out of this. I even remember I convinced my friend to let me keep the box and the manual, so when I'd go home at night, when I couldn't stay over and play it every night, I had to go home at some point, I would sit and just sift through the manual hour after hour, just reading all I could about this game because I loved it that much. Like I said, I'm horrible at it today, but I still like the franchise. I really liked the new Mortal Kombat they released a couple of years ago for the Xbox 360 and PS3, so the franchise still does have a lot of sentimental value for me. Might not be one I'm going to play a whole lot now just because have somehow gotten progressively worse at video games, but it's going to make the list. It's going to go in at number 10, Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis, starting off the list at number 10. Moving on then to the second entry on my list, the number 9 spot is a game in which you heard a little bit of the soundtrack from earlier, that being Gaiares. And if you like shoot-'em-up games, certainly the Genesis was a system that you were going to get your fix. And of course, going on even into the Saturn, which really, really took it up a notch. It had a lot of good shoot-'em-ups. But this isn't about the Saturn. This is about the Genesis. And my favorite side-scrolling shoot-'em-up on the system, probably one of my favorites all time, was Gaiares. And while it doesn't break away from the traditional shmup formula too much, you're a spaceship going from left to right, and there's bullets everywhere, everything's trying to kill you, you upgrade your weapons and try to get to the end and beat the boss. That's pretty much how it is, and this game just does all of that so perfectly, and like I said, from the music, which is phenomenal, this game has one of the best soundtracks, not only in the 16-bit era, but for my money, in the history of video games ever. And it's just, the gameplay is so fun. Even though I'm not good at these games, like I am with most games, and admittedly, for somebody that plays video games as much as I do, I'm pretty damn bad at them. But I really, really enjoy this game. And it's one that either I can sit down and play through a stage for 5 minutes, or I can sit for 3 or 4 hours on an open night and just go at it forever. I love this game that much. And it has one of the most memorable villain names in video game history. The queen of the space pirates that you're taking on in this game is named ZZ Bud Nasty or Bad Nusty or something. And it's awesome. Like just these horrible, just corny character names. This obviously was a Japanese import. So just weird things happen in the localization process, and that was one of them. But I love it. So Gaiares had to be on this list. Super fun. Has a really cool mechanic where you have this sort of drone that floats around you and you shoot it out, and when it hits an enemy, it steals their power from them. So if an enemy has like a cool gun that you want, like say they have like one that like shoots fire in 3 different directions or just shoots this big huge block of energy that takes up half the screen, you can get that, and that's really fun, and it really changes the way you look at a level, changes the way you approach certain situations. And the more you run into these enemies, you can capture it again and upgrade the weapon, and it's just very fun, and it gives you a lot of different options to kind of go about playing the game. So, I'm not a huge shmup fan, but I love this one. I think it's one of the best on the system. So it makes the list right there at number 9. At the number 8 spot then is a kind of obscure platformer. I know it does kind of have a cult following these days, and for good reason. I love this game. This game is called Decap Attack, starring Chuck D. Head. And if I'm remembering this right, it was a game that didn't... Well, let me back up a little bit. Like the game's title implies, the star of it is named Chuck D. Head, and he's this sort of like mutilated, mummified body and he can like take off your head and like throw it at people. It's just awesome. I mean, it's a pretty standard platforming game. In that aspect, there's nothing terribly memorable about it, but just something about the character of Chuck D. Head that was just so bizarre and weird that I fell in love with this game. And much like Gaiares before it, one of the primary reasons that I enjoyed this game so much was the soundtrack. And you actually hear one of the level themes, I think it's from the 3rd level in this game, at the beginning of every single episode of the show, and you will continue to hear it at the beginning of every single episode of the show because it is absolutely one of my favorite video game songs of all time. And this is probably one off this list that if you're listening to this, you probably haven't played and you may not have even heard of. And I really recommend, you can find this game for so cheap out there. If you want to play it I would recommend playing it on the original hardware. To me, that's just the truest experience. But hey, if you don't have the hardware, don't want to expend the effort to go find it, go download the ROM, go download an emulator, play it for a little bit. I guarantee you it's going to be well worth your time. You know, in an era when consoles were just so inundated with platformers, while this one may not be one of the most original from a gameplay standpoint, the presentation, the music, the look of it, to me is really unique and does give the game a whole lot of charm, enough to make up for the fact that in most ways it is a pretty average platformer, admittedly, but it just has this charm about it that I really enjoy. So if you're into platforming games, especially ones from this era, go check out Decap Attack. Onward then to number 7. In that spot, I have Mutant Football League from EA. And what this game is, it runs on the Madden engine. So in many ways, it's very similar to the Madden games of the era, but with one very, very big twist. This game is like a futuristic, post-apocalyptic version of football, being that you're playing as like ogres and monsters and playing like on moons and all sorts of crazy shit like that. And you can run plays where you know there's mines in the field, or you can bribe the ref, and hey, if that doesn't work, you can literally just fucking kill the ref. You know, that's my kind of football game. I wish, you know, that was an option in today's Madden games. Like, how great would that be? You get a bull call against you, you can have somebody go out there and pop one in the ref's head. Okay, maybe not a great idea, but anyways, that's what I liked about this game. It was just so over the top ridiculous. It took football and, you know, it maintained a lot of what you know about American football today. In that aspect, the gameplay was really similar, but it added just this layer of just ludicrousness on top of it, and it was just so much fun. It's one today that I'll break out at a party and, play Mutant Football League, and people still absolutely love it. It's just still so much fun today, just because there really has never been another game like it. I mean, they have a new one called Blood Bowl. I think it's for PCs, but it's not. It's the same sort of concept, but with a different gameplay style. From what I understand, that's more of like kind of a real-time strategy sort of game. But this is just like a straight-up Madden-style football game, just with monsters and violence and just over-the-top hilarity. It gets points for me just for being so unique. That, there really hasn't been a product like it. But on top of that, it does execute what it set out to do really well and is a ton of fun. Mutant Football League from EA at number 7. I highly recommend, like I said with Decap Attack, this one's so affordable that you can probably go down to your local game store and, find one for a couple bucks, or on eBay for a couple bucks plus shipping. So check it out. Mutant League Football at number 7. In the number 6 spot then is going to be another game from Electronic Arts. This one is called Desert Strike, and it's more of an action game. You take control of a helicopter in the Gulf War and just go on these missions, whether it's, rescuing hostages or blowing up bases. And you do it from like a sort of isometric kind of Zaxxon type of perspective. It is a hard game. I play it now. I have a copy, and I don't, just in the same way with Mortal Kombat, I do not understand how I used to be so good at this as a kid. And this is one I never owned as a kid, but when my cousin would come over, it was this game and another game that I'm going to get to later on the list that we would rent every single time and just play them for hours and hours and hours on end. But this game does make the list because not only, like I said, did I enjoy it a lot as a kid, but the gameplay is so tight, it's so solid. It is a big challenge. You're not going to go into Desert Strike and beat this thing in a few hours. This is going to take you some time to kind of acclimate yourself to the controls. But it is a lot of fun just flying around the desert, blowing shit up. It's a lot of fun. I really like it. There's not a whole lot of substance to it, but it is a nice, fun action game. When I was a kid, I was really into like the military aircraft. My favorite movie of all time that I'd watch almost every day was Top Gun. So obviously this game appealed to me quite a bit, and I was not disappointed when I played it. I think there was actually a sequel they released called Jungle Strike, if I remember right. I haven't played that one, but if it's anything like this one, it's got to be an awesome game. So that is the number 6 pick, Desert Strike from Electronic Arts. Moving on then to the bottom half of the list, my top 5 favorite games for the Sega Genesis. Starting it out at number 5 is going to be Streets of Rage 2. And now this is one I'm sure a lot of you have played. It is one of the more iconic, more well-known games for the Sega Genesis. This was released at a time when these sort of side-scrolling beat-em-ups were a really big thing. Of course, you had the X-Men games, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games, and even, I'm sure a lot of you remember this one, the Simpsons game in the arcades. Those are so hugely popular at the time, so it only made sense that they tried to make competing products similar to those on the home consoles, and at least in my opinion, none of them did it better than Streets of Rage 2. This is another game. It nailed the gameplay. It had that Twitch aspect to it to where it'd keep you coming back. Even after it repeatedly kicked your ass, you kept dying, but you kept coming back. And when this game is most fun is it's played with multiple people. So this game starts out and you either select from one of 4 of these kind of futuristics. There's like a cyberpunk kind of overall feel to the game. So you pick from one of these 4 fighters, and you can do it with friends, and that's what makes it really fun, is just tackling these huge levels with these ridiculous enemies together. And they come at you on motorcycles, and they're in cars and throwing things at you, and you can beat people up with crowbars. It's just a hell of a lot of fun. We all played these games, these beat 'em up games back then. They were so popular. But if you're looking for a good one on a home console, Streets of Rage 2 is where it's at. Again, one of the more common games on the system. You can find it for super cheap. So, if you haven't yet played this game, I implore you, Streets of Rage 2, go grab a copy of this, grab a friend, maybe grab a few beers, settle in, and just have some fun. I love this game so much, and it deserves to be on the top 5 list of best Sega Genesis games ever. Moving on then to number 4. One of my probably favorite top 3 platforming games ever. I'm sure a lot of you saw this one coming. This one's kind of a stereotypical best Sega Genesis games list ever entry, but that's fine. This one's Sonic the Hedgehog 3. I absolutely loved all the Sonic games, but this to me, it took the formula that was established in the first 2 games and perfected it, and I don't think, at least in terms of a 2D Sonic, that Sega has even come close to matching the magic that they put together on this entry in this series. And this is a game I didn't have, again, as a kid. I didn't have much of these because I wasn't allowed to have video games for quite some time, but my cousin had this game, and every time I would go to his house, this was like one of the first things I did. I was like, all right, where's Sonic 3? And I can still like mentally picture like every single aspect of that first, I think it's the Angel Island zone and the first level of that game, and the music in that level, and it's just how colorful and just how finely tuned everything was. This was the epitome of Sonic Mania to me. This really captured the essence and the energy that Sega set out to accomplish with Sonic the Hedgehog when they first released the original entry in the series in 1991. This perfected it. I think this gives Super Mario World and, those SNES platformers a run for their money. I think mentioning Sonic 3 in the same breath as Super Mario World, as Yoshi's Island, is absolutely fair. I think this is a phenomenal game, one of the best of the era, one of the best 2D platformers of all time. You all know it, you've all played it. Sonic 3, what more needs to be said? It's in there at number 4. But giving that glowing endorsement, there are still 3 games left on the list. Yes, 3 games that, despite all the praise I just heaped onto Sonic 3, that I enjoyed even more. And the first of those, starting off the top 3, the bronze medal winner of this top 10 is NHL 96. And I know this is not a real common pick in a way. Obviously, NHL 94 is the most famous, the most beloved version of this series, at least in this era, and with good reason. I think it really took what had been established in the first 2 NHL games and perfected it, much in the same way Sonic 3 did with the first 2 in that game, or in that series. And if you were to, I easily could interchange NHL 94 with NHL 96, and there really isn't much of a difference. I just picked NHL 96 because it pretty much was the same game, but it had more updated rosters, and it's the one I just happened to play more of. I have all the NHL games that were released for the Genesis, and I still will go back and play them all the time, but it always just comes back around to this one, and I'm not sure why, but I just have so many awesome memories with this game, and it's interesting in a lot of ways. This game was really the last of what I consider kind of the old hockey, like back when you had the Nordiques, you had the Jets, the Whalers. I guess the Jets are back now, but the old Jets before they moved to Phoenix. Sadly, this was after us Minnesotans lost our beloved North Stars, but it does have some of those classic teams, and it's really interesting because this game was made right after the Nordiques had moved to Colorado, but they're still known as the Nordiques in this, yet they have Patrick Waugh and that whole roster that they had assembled for the Colorado team that year, which I think is fun, and that's the team I would always play and won the Stanley Cup with in the game, much like the Colorado Avalanche would in real life that year. But this is just such a phenomenal game. If you haven't played the NHL games for the Sega Genesis, you are really missing out. There were so many sports games back then. If you were a sports fan or not, you had fun with these games, much like another one I've got coming up on my list here that I'm pretty sure is not going to surprise anybody that knows me. But it's just such a fun game. Whether you like hockey or even really know anything about the sport, you can have fun playing this game. And I saw that evidence so many times. I mean, up until a few years ago, even I lived in this place that we so affectionately called the Lodge, where it's just basically a house that all my friends came to, and we just got drunk all the time. And at this place, we had a Sega Genesis set up, and it was pretty much NHL 96 that was in the cartridge slot and never came out, and we would just play it just till we couldn't open our eyes anymore, and we were drunk out of our minds. But it's just so much fun. It's just a period of my life I look back on and just kind of smile at, and NHL 96 was a fun part of that, so it had to go high on this list. But really, if you're gonna, you can pick up basically any of these games except NHL 95. Avoid that like the fucking plague, because that game is garbage. And thankfully, with NHL 96, they basically just re-released NHL 94 with new rosters, and for good reason. It's an awesome game. Top 3 Genesis games of all time for me. All right, well, we are running really short on time here. I'm gonna kind of try to wrap this up pretty quick. So moving on to the runner-up for my top 10 Sega Genesis games ever is NBA Jam Tournament Edition. And this is one I know everybody out there has played, whether it be in the arcades, whether it be on any of the fucking dozens of consoles it was released for. To me, this is like the ultimate party game of the 16-bit era. Much like NHL, you didn't need to understand or know anything about basketball when you played this, but this game was just so fun, and it's just so iconic in so many ways. To me, it transcends video games in terms of 90s pop culture. It's part of 90s pop culture, right up there with Nirvana and, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's just so crucial to. It's just such a important cross-section of the culture at the time, and I absolutely love it. Just for everything from the "he's on fire," the announcers, and the spinning, front-flipping, back or glass-breaking dunks. This game I was such a huge fan of back in the day, not just being just a video game fan, but I ate, slept, and blah. I can't even talk. I'm getting so excited about NBA Jam. I was just all about basketball back then, and this game let me play as my heroes, but then lit them on fire and let them do crazy spinning shit, and oh my god, it was awesome. And it's not a basketball simulator. It's very arcadey. To me, this game, it doesn't require any skill. There's no being good at NBA Jam. It's a lot of luck, but I think that's what makes it fun. You can, grab a bottle of whiskey, plug in NBA Jam, and you've got yourself a good night with a couple of friends. It's just one of the most fun games that have ever been released, ever. And to me, not only one of the best Genesis titles, but one of the greatest sports titles of all time. So that leads me to number 1, my absolute favorite Sega Genesis game ever, and that is the incomparable Road Rash. And if you've never played Road Rash, you are fucking missing out, because this is one of the greatest games, not only for the system, but ever. What this basically was it was a motorcycle racing game, much like Super Hang-On, but it added an element of Streets of Rage to where if somebody was annoying you or somebody's trying to get by you, you could hit them in the fucking head with a crowbar or a tire iron. It was amazing. And it was just so much fun, and just the fact that you could do that, but at the same time, the racing and the controls were so tight that it was just, to me, one of the most perfect racing games of all time. And, you had the cops chasing after you, so you'd start hearing the sirens come up behind you, and you'd start freaking out, and holy shit, it's like, oh my god. And it was just nonstop chaos, nonstop fun. They had like a career mode where you raced all these different tracks and you could upgrade to a faster bike. It's just, to me, there are few games that I just had more pure, unadulterated fun with than I did Road Rash. And unfortunately, they don't make any more of these games today. I have no fucking clue why. It's basically a license to print money, if you ask me. It's such a beloved series, especially this first entry, and even the later entries, Road Rash 2 and 3 for the Genesis. Or even I have a copy for the PlayStation, which is basically the same game with Soundgarden over it, which is pretty fucking awesome. But this is just a game that I go back to every time I plug in my Genesis. I've got to play at least one round of Road Rash, and it just conjures up such fun memories for me. Me and my cousin, we would rent this every single New Year's and just play it until we fell asleep, and it never got old. Until still to this day, I plug in Road Rash and it's like I'm 9 years old again. And to me, that's what embodies a great game. You know, getting by on its merits, not just from its nostalgia. Certainly that's a part of it, but I can still plug this in today, and it's not purely just a nostalgia trip. This is still fun, and when I play it, you know, it's still just as exciting, just as crazy to me as it was when I originally played it when I was 9 years old. So that's why it's number one on this list, and for various other reasons. It had some great, just cheesy 16-bit heavy metal music in it. Just overall, the perfect package. So there it is. I'm going to run through the list one more time, and then we will get out of here. At 10, Mortal Kombat. At 9, Gaiares. At 8, Decap Attack. At 7, Mutant League Football. At 6, Desert Strike. At 5, Streets of Rage 2. Number 4, Sonic 3. At 3, NHL 96. At number 2, NBA Jam Tournament Edition. And at the top spot, at the top of the Sega Genesis mountain, is the classic Road Rash.